Here is Sailor Studio 970, a green ink. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. A light and bright green that stays easy to read on the page, a color that is a perfect ink for spring writing. Now, there is a tiny amount of tone variation as paper changes, and there is a little bit of shading, but just a little, or rather, it never gets dark in its shading. Now, on non-fountain pen friendly paper, it stays as completely serviceable as an ink that you don't need to avoid certain papers. A great green in the Sailor Studio line that the only problem I see is it would get used up very quickly if you had a bottle. The pen for today is a Platinum 3776 with a medium nib. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Here we see that lighter, really refreshing green on the page. Such great tones going on. It's not feathering and it's not spreading. It is shading in spots, not to say that it isn't. Take a look at Not Stay Here on the second line, where the no is lighter than the T, and the S is quite a bit lighter than the TA, which are a nice mid-tone. The Y gets quite a bit darker, where here starts as a nice mid-tone, gets lighter on the ER, but much darker with the E at the end. Looking at the back of the page, between the wiggling fingers, we see we have no bleeding, no ghosting, a very well-behaved ink. Let's take a look at some other inks from the same manufacturer. Here is Sailor Studio 650. Here is Sailor Studio 653. Here is Sailor Studio 664. Here is Sailor Studio 723. The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook. As a tone, this is slightly lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, though not a ton, and if you're not looking at it side by side, you're probably not going to see it. It's not feathering and it's not spreading. It is shading just a little bit. You do get to see some of those darker areas with this, like with on the first line, where the WI is quite a bit lighter than the TH, and even the H shows some nice midtones in it. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and have a very easy time continuing our notes back here. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook. The tone on the page here is a bit brighter, and I want to call it a richer tone for comparison to the Clairfontaine. Now, it's not feathering and it's not spreading, and that's a truck that's going by because everything has to go on when you're filming. It doesn't feather and it doesn't spread. It does give some very light shading at times. If you take a look at sorry and like, first and second line, then you see when it crosses over, it gets quite a bit darker. Same thing happens to them on the second line, where the T crosses that H, it really does darken up a bit. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and can easily continue notes here. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook. This gives us the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread. It does shade just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. It doesn't have a problem standing out against the quad rule, and it doesn't have a problem with being cut by those lines, so it's a strong ink in this way, where when inks get cut by the lines, it really tends to bother me. It draws my eye to areas I don't don't want to be looking at. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, no problems. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Ackerman, their number 28. Here is Birmingham Pen Company, Southside Park Fern Moss. Here is Colorverse 39 Supernatural for the Opus 88 Picnic Green. Here is Diamine Ultra Green.
The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook. Here the tone is slightly lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Mostly really lighter because it's almost all the lightest tone. It's not feathering, it's not spreading. There is some very light shading that is going on here. You can see it just a little bit with beneath the H at the end, or there on the third line where the T is a little bit darker than the HER, but the E at the end is quite a bit darker. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and can easily continue our school notes here. While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page.
Here is Diamine Sunset. Here is TWSBI 1791 Royal Purple. Here is Montegrappa Black. Here is Diamine Crimson.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. This is a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does have some very light feathering going on. It does have a little bit of spread going on. However, I think this stays in a serviceable spot. You could use this even with, these broader nibs. It's not being a major problem. There are a couple areas of shading that you do see happening. It's nice in what's it's going on. It's doing very well with the cheaper papers. Looking at the back of the page, you can see there's quite a few areas where the ink gets very deep into the paper, so you likely cannot continue your notes back here, but it did not bleed through touching the page underneath. So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink? The 3776 Music Nib is a drier pen and gives decent shading. Now, off camera, I tried a medium flow, medium nib, and it slightly darkened and it did shade more, but not much darker and just a bit more frequently shading. Now, for this reason, I say you go with a medium flow, medium nib, just for that added benefit of a little bit more shading. I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.